It's the bye week, so we're reviewing the roster and the offense to see which players and position groups have lived up to expectation and who needs to step up with 7 games left to play this season.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, your very humble host. And of course, today we are going to be breaking down the Falcons' positional breakdown on offense because it's the bye week. And again, it's a little beyond the halfway point in the season, but we can kind of take a look back at the first half of the season and the next half of the season to look at these groups. This is not meant to be a comprehensive sort of breakdown. That's for the end of this season, obviously, when we have a full 17 games to look at, but just kind of a general overview at each position group. So we'll be breaking that down, starting with the quarterbacks, then we'll get to the running backs and offensive line, and then we'll get to the weapons. But I do want to thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. Of course, give a special shout out to the everydayers. And to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's start off with the quarterback position. And of course, that means we get to talk about Desmond Ridder. No Tyler Heineke talk on today's episode. And I think it's easy to look at Desmond Ridder's performance this season due to his benching and say, chalk it up as, he's been a major disappointment. And I think in some ways he has disappointed, but I think in other ways he hasn't. I think, the ways that he has been mostly looking at the turnovers and negative plays. And, that was the one thing that probably could have potentially derailed his season more than anything else, which is not being able to play clean football. And he is disappointed in that regard. And it would be one thing, if he was having like one turnover worthy play a game or whatever. Like Houston's the only game, according to PFF, that he didn't have any turnover worthy plays. And one a game is something that you can live with. Like that's kind of the price of youth. Like you look at CJ Stroud and Jordan Love and others like that. That's kind of where they're at. But the fact that you're getting not only at least one per game, but you're getting several games this year where you've gotten 3 or 4 has been really where the problem has been. And then when you think of like negative plays like the sacks, especially his last start against the Titans where he was sacked 5 times and a half. But to be fair to Desmond Ridder, some of those sacks, a large percentage of, or not, I shouldn't say a large percentage of that, but a larger, number of those sacks compared to a lot of other quarterbacks in the league have been, for no yards, right? And that's basically indicative of him basically trying to run and getting tackled, as he hits the line of scrimmage, right? And so I do think a little bit of the narrative, like he's not dealing well with pressure, is a little bit overrated based off of that, because I don't think all of those sacks are just like him just taking sacks. It's just, he's a quarterback that gets tackled at the line of scrimmage and that goes down as a sack. But, when you look at his performance last year when under pressure, he was PFF's highest graded player in the league during his 4 starts under pressure. And this year he's bottom 7. So it clearly has not been as good, but again, I don't know, in certain ways it's been a little bit exaggerated to me. So for that reason, like, those are some of the areas where Ridder has kind of disappointed. But I think despite all that, like, he's also shown some good film. And when you look at his season since the London game, and, those first 4 games were mostly bad, if you ask me, some good sprinkled in there, but it was mostly bad. It was like 75% mediocre to bad and like 25% good at best. And that's probably being really generous with those first 4 games. And I feel like that's kind of flipped in his last 4 starts, where it's been 75% that's been mediocre to good and 25% terrible. But like the numbers kind of back up that you've seen that progress over the last couple of his last couple starts before his benching, right? You look at, you know, I think the eye test show that and the advanced numbers show that because you look at things like expected points added, right? If you look at his numbers since the London game, he was 15th in terms of EPA per drop back or per play, which includes runs. And his EPA per play was the same as what Justin Herbert's was a year ago, right? You look at adjusted net yards per attempt or ANYA, is sort of my preferred efficiency metric. You know, since the London game, he was 14th in the league, and his ANYA was about 6.4, which is basically identical to what Ryan Tannehill's was a year ago when he was a top 12 quarterback. And then you look at his PFF passing grade, he ranked 22nd since the London game, but his passing grade was about a 63, which is basically slightly higher than what Marcus Mariota's was, if you round up, a year ago. So again, I think those are good comparisons for where Ridder is at this point as a first-year starter, a second-year player. And, there's still obviously room for improvement in the last 7 games, and hopefully you will get that level of play but better especially if he can eliminate some of those negative plays, eliminate the turnovers. And then all of a sudden, like you're legitimately talking about, a top 15-ish, quarterback in the league or something closer to league average, but not league average in a bad way, right? League average in like, hey, that's solid. Again, for a first year starter, that's very solid, is what you're looking for. And so that's why I say, like, I don't know if Ridder is a disappointment in that regard, because my expectation was that he would just kind of be a league average starter, but it's been a much bumpier ride to get to that point. If he gets to that point, then, I think we thought. And so for that reason, I think there's understandable skepticism over whether or not we'll see that sort of improvement from Ridder over this back half of the season, or will it continue to be sort of a lot of good, a lot of bad, and just, overall just kind of like, I don't know if he's the guy. So, that leads us to the offseason outlook that we'll be doing for each one of these position groups. And obviously the biggest question going into the season and still remains the season, do the Falcons have a capable starting quarterback? And we don't have a definitive answer at this point in time, and hopefully we will have one at the end of the season. But I think these next 7 games are going to go a very long way to answering that question. Hopefully we'll have a more definitive answer, either good or bad. And depending on that answer, will determine what the Falcons do this offseason. I think the Falcons will have options if they want to try and upgrade their quarterback play this offseason. The question to me is whether or not they'll have good options to try to do that, right? So there will be opportunities for them to at least bring in new blood into the building at the quarterback position. We'll just wonder, we'll sit here, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, whether or not, that new blood is good blood, I guess you could say. So we'll see. Time will tell on that issue, but we will talk a little bit about the running game, which I do think has been the biggest disappointment. Not because of the running backs, but mostly due to the offensive line. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So good, bad, in between. It's tough to root for your favorite team on an empty stomach. So order your faves with DoorDash. If your team is winning, order something to celebrate. If they're losing, place an order as that pick-me-up. DoorDash has the unbeatable deals on everything you need to watch or for your tailgate. All your favorite restaurants, stores, retail, grocery are all on the app, so you can shop for everything to get yourself game day ready. You can get 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order. When you download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23, subject to change, terms apply. That's 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order. When you download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23, don't forget to use that code LOCKED23, LOCKED23, for 50% off up to a $10 value on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more, subject to change, terms apply. So before we get into the running backs and offensive line position group, I do want to plug that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering all the top stories of the day from the local experts across the Locked On network, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports today on YouTube and subscribe for the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. So talking running backs and offensive line, it makes sense to kind of put these two groups together because they're kind of interlinked when it comes to the running game. And when we talk about disappointments, I think the running game has been, to me at least, the biggest disappointment so far this season. You expected, or at least I expected, the Falcons to have one of the top rushing attacks in the league, an elite unit, and they're not. Right now, if you look at volume stats like yards per game, they still rank highly. They're 7th in the NFL currently in that. But if you go beyond that, and I think the eye test also confirms this, they're much closer to an average unit. They're 17th in DVOA. They're 21st in rushing EPA. Right, they were, I think, 3rd in DVOA last year. They were 4th in rushing EPA last year. So they were a top 4 unit, the advanced metrics last year, and now they're average to below average. And some of that, I think, is owed to this. They're not getting as many explosive runs as they did a year ago. But I don't think that's because they're less explosive, at least at the running back position. I think that's, again, another testament that the blocking has regressed and the offensive line play has regressed. I think it's regressed both in the run game and in the pass game, although I think the regression in the run game has been far more noticeable than it has been in the pass game. I think, the pass game, a lot of last year, I thought Arthur Smith did a great job kind of masking their pass protection woes with play action passing, and he has not leaned as much in pass play action this year. And, that sort of, I guess you could say, added confidence that Arthur Smith has in the blocking to hold up has not been always, delivered, I guess, from that unit. Like, there have been some games where the offensive line has played well. There's been several games, I think, in the bad games have outweighed the good, where the offensive line in terms of pass protection has not held up. So, overall, not great when it comes to the Falcons play in the trenches. And anybody who's been a regular listener to this podcast over the last 2 years knows that, my mood when it comes, my optimism, my hope with the Atlanta Falcons waxes and wanes based off of their trench play on both sides of the ball. But we'll talk about the other side of the ball at a later date. But when we look at the individual players on the offensive line, I feel like all the returning starters, with the exception of Drew Dalman, have taken some step back this year. I feel like Dalman's basically the same. And because everybody else has taken a step back, like, that feels like positive, but it's not really, it's just kind of like he's in the same spot he was a year ago. And everybody else is just like a step back. And because like Jake and Jake Matthews and Chris Lindstrom were so good last year, that step back has, for them, even though they're still good this year, but they were like really good last year, that step back has been more problematic. I think Caleb McGarry is about the same as he was a year ago in pass protection, but he's not as dominant as a run blocker. So it's harder to overlook the pass protection woes as it was a year ago. When it comes to Matthew Bergeron, I've been underwhelmed with Bergeron, especially as a run blocker. And anytime I feel like, well, he's made progress as a pass protector, I'm like, then he has, a bad game. And then I'm just like, oh, okay. So, I'm not going to bash Bergeron too much, but he's just been underwhelming to me. And, he's a rookie, so it's easy to dismiss that, but I just haven't been that impressed. Now, when we look at the running backs, I think Bijan has been as good as advertised as a runner. Any issues with his production, he hasn't been the most efficient runner this year when you look at his success rates, but, I think that's more owed to the blocking than it is, anything wrong with him. The only knock on Bijan I've had is, like, he hasn't been as good in the passing game as I thought, like, whether that's as a blocker, as a receiver, or as a route runner. Those have all been less than I would like. Cordero Patterson, has basically been a non-factor for the most part on offense this year, which is a little bit underwhelming. Allgeier's been solid, unspectacular. He's basically the same player he was in the first half of last season. And then we saw last year, he really exploded in the second half of the year. And so the hope is that, we'll see a similar sort of improvement for him after the bye week. So we'll see about that. And so again, there's room across the board for all of these guys to improve after the bye week. And hopefully we'll see more of that. We did see the offensive line tended to get better from like week 10 on last year. So again, we're roughly are at that same point. So hopefully we'll see that again. There's still reason to hope that we can get that elite unit, that that elite running game and improved pass protection that we were hoping for, that strong trench play, so to speak, that we were hoping for going into the year, for the rest of the season. Now, when we look ahead to the off season, I'm expecting the Falcons to run it back with the same starting five, barring anything crazy happening over these next 7 games. They'll probably wind up investing some assets, probably a premium draft pick, like a day 2 pick, into an offensive tackle to upgrade that swing tackle spot, and that will give them sort of an insurance policy in the event that McGarry doesn't have a rebound season next year and go back to being that elite run blocker, and or Jake Matthews takes another step back next year. At the running back position, you're probably going to move off of Cordero Patterson, and getting Avery Williams back healthy next year will help kind of fill that void if that is the case. But I don't think it would be an issue if the Falcons added a little bit more juice at the running back position, maybe like a day 3 draft pick or something like that. So we'll see. And speaking of adding more juice, we'll talk about the receivers and the weapons, looking at both the wide receivers and the tight ends to wrap up today's episode, as we do this sort of bye-week breakdown, and we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So whether you're on extended travel or bracing for a major weather event or limited by yet another supply chain shortage, you are covered. Thanks to our partners over at Jace Medical, their life-saving antibiotics and a long list of daily medications can be ordered now in a 1-year supply, even ED generics like Cialis and Viagra. So go online right now at jacemedical.com to receive your 12-month supply of your daily medications. Remember to use the promo code Locked On at checkout, and you'll get a discount. Don't get caught unprepared, and everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. So if you or someone you love would love to get some peace of mind by having a year supply of any daily med, just go to jacemedical.com to see if it's offered for you. Remember to use the promo code Locked On for a $20 discount off at purchase. Use the code Locked On at checkout at jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code Locked On. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, let's talk about the wide receiver and tight end position. And, much is made about Drake London and Kyle Pitts' lack of production by a vocal subset of the fan base and, maybe media members, especially if you happen to work in fantasy football media. Again, I'll be an apologist here, but I think that's a little overrated. Like, London's basically on pace to put up pretty much identical production that he had a year ago as a rookie. Similar to Desmond Ridder, like if you look at Kyle Pitts' production since the London game, he's been producing on par with what is pretty typically a top 3 or top 5 tight end on an annual basis. But I think because of where those guys were drafted, and I think it was reasonable to expect that we would see even more production out of those guys this year. I think, they're basically on pace to have like 65 to 70-ish catches for like 750 to 800-ish yards for either one of those guys. And I think when you look at what their ceiling potential to be, I think you look at that type of production, you say that's a disappointment based off of what their projected ceilings are. And I think that's fair to say that neither one of those guys have quite consistently reached the ceiling. We've seen glimpses of it this year, but it hasn't been something consistent this year. And I don't think that's a problem, but I think because of high expectations based off of where they were drafted, and because I think we as Falcon fans grew accustomed to having that sort of elite pass catcher in our offense for the last decade, not having that player in our offense feels like a disappointment to a lot of folks. Now, because of that, like the one knock I would give on London and Pitts is they haven't shown that they can be that sort of true blue number 1 type of weapon that you can build your entire offense around or your entire passing attack around. But frankly, there's probably only like maybe a dozen of those wide receivers in the league, and probably only like one tight end that you would say is on quite on that level. And so to me, if Drake London happens to be, say the 17th best wide receiver, or Kyle Pitts happens to be the third or fourth best tight end in the league, that's not a disappointment to me. But I know to other folks that may be considered one, because again, their expectation is that, these guys have to be historically good based off of whatever is the reasons for those expectations. But I don't think that's necessarily fair. So, I think when I look at the rest of the wide receiver group, the Falcons have made a major shift at their, depth chart midseason after that Van Jefferson trade. And he's sort of taken over in terms of snaps as the number 2 wide receiver. You've had Kadero Hodge be the number 3. Scotty Miller's the number 4. And poor old Mac Hollins has been relegated to the 5th wide receiver that basically blocks and plays special teams. Now, since that trade, I think Hodge and Miller have flashed and made plays like you would expect as a number 3 and number 4 wide receiver would. So I don't think they've been disappointing in the slightest in that capacity. Jefferson has not really had those same moments especially as a number 2 guy. So hopefully you'll see more of that in, after the bye week. And you'll also continue to see Hodge and Miller and, occasionally Mac Hollins make some plays as they have over the course of the season. When you look at the tight end group, I think Jonnu Smith has been kind of a revelation because of his ability after the catch. Like, he's basically kind of taken over the CP role as the guy, just get the ball into his hands and let him cook after the catch. He's been basically that guy throughout the season, so that's a positive. MyCole Pruitt, has, I think, probably performed typically as a normal third tight end / blocking tight end. And that would be okay if we just didn't have a year like we had last year, where the guy that had that role, Parker Hesse, was outstanding in that role. And so it feels like much more of a disappointment based off of, the high bar that Parker Hesse set. Now, when we look to the offseason for this group, I think the goal is going to be getting more explosive, especially at the wide receiver position. Ideally, you would find a true blue number 1 wide receiver, but obviously that's easier said than done. And I do think adding a number 2 wide receiver, especially one that has a lot more juice, may not be as valuable, but would be very valuable to this group. And we'll see, what level of investment the Falcons are willing to make at that position. I think it should be pretty high. Obviously, I won't say it's like their top priority, but it's pretty high on my personal list right now. They got to figure out quarterback, obviously, is going to be more of a priority. Probably edge rusher is probably going to be more of a priority, but I'd probably put it at number 3 right now in terms of like things that are priorities to add this offseason. But we'll see, right? Basically what I'm saying is, like, ideally you can find a Justin Jefferson, right? But if you have to quote unquote settle for like Jalen Waddle, I think, I'm not going to complain about finding Jalen Waddle, is basically what I'm saying. That, again, not saying you have to get that exact player, but something like that, where, Waddle is a really good number 2. But, at the tight end position, when you look towards the offseason, I'm assuming that they'll probably move off of MyCole Pruitt. And whether that means Parker Hesse or John Fitzpatrick will be sort of the in-house candidate to replace that guy. But I certainly would not be shocked if the Falcons added another body at that spot, especially someone that can add value both as a blocker and also add more value than either Fitzpatrick or Hesse does as a pass catcher, and more value than MyCole Pruitt has as a pass catcher. So we'll see if again, that's probably like a day 3 draft pick or something like that. But, someone like Cade Stover at Ohio State is a player I picture, in the 4th round or something like that. But we'll see. We'll see how that all goes. But that's going to do it for us in our sort of bye-week roster review. We'll do one of these for the defense. I don't know exactly if that's going to come out before or after, the normal next episode, which will be, chatting with Jarvis, getting his thoughts on things. But you'll get 6 episodes. That's the plan this week, as opposed to normal 5. Just as, for those of you that, aren't ready to take a break from the Atlanta Falcons quite yet for your bye weeks, you'll have something to listen to. Again, this was not meant to be a comprehensive breakdown. We'll do that after the season if all things go according to plan and I get to go back to the Senior Bowl this year, it'll probably be a similar timetable as we did last year, where the week before the Senior Bowl, which is late January, early February, did the positional breakdown for the offense, and then after the Senior Bowl was the defense. And rather than trying to cram all of that into one episode, separating it into individual episodes. So that would be the plan. And obviously we'll be able to go much deeper at each position and each player, especially at that point. We'll have 17 games to talk about rather than 9 or 10 or how many games we played. 10, right? So that is the plan moving forward. I don't know if the next episode is going to be that defensive breakdown, or it's going to be my chat with Jarvis about what his thoughts are on the team during the bye week. But you can look forward to both of those episodes probably dropping in the next 24 to 36 hours on your audio feed. So continue to make us your first listen, make us your first watch on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And what else should I plug? Go check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 YouTube streaming channel. We of course have a Locked On Sports Atlanta 24/7 YouTube streaming channel. So if you're wanting to get all your Braves, Hawks, Bulldogs, Falcons, and etc. content on the same channel, you can always throw that on in the background whenever you're doing stuff. Always appreciate that. So you can check that out as well, and continue to make us your first listen. Continue to check out Locked On NFL as your second listen if you want to stay tuned to what's going on with the rest of the league during this bye week. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Kickoff Live Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time on whatever Locked On NFL channel that you're like, including Locked On Falcons. So subscribe to Locked On Falcons if you haven't already, so that you can get that live at Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. That's going to get you geared up for this weekend's Falcons free, stress-free weekend of football games. So that's always enjoyable. You can always appreciate football a lot more when you don't have to worry about the Falcons bringing down your mood, right? So check that out on Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time, guys. So that's going to do it for us here. We'll be back with more roster reviews, positional breakdowns on the defensive side of the ball, as well as talking with Jarvis as the rest of the week unfolds. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.